In the 1500s, Spanish and Portuguese explorers wrote in their diaries. They described astonishing encounters at the edge of the world. They saw towering men. These men were twice their height. They roamed the freezing coasts of Patagonia. For centuries, historians dismissed these stories. They called them exaggerations. They said they were myths, sailors' tales, nothing more. But everything changed. An excavation team in Tierra del Fuego recovered bones. These bones didn't match any known human dimensions. A small DNA fragment was analysed. The sample returned shocking results. Genetic anomalies inconsistent with any modern human lineage. Tonight, we trace the legends. We examine the science. We explore the alleged cover-ups. We investigate the shocking possibility something non-human once walked the southern edge of the continent. Patagonia sits at the bottom of South America. It's one of the most remote places on Earth. Wild winds sweep across empty plains. Glaciers carve through mountains. The ocean crashes against rocky shores. Few people live here. Even today, it feels like the edge of the world. This is where the legend was born. A legend about giants. Men so tall, they made ordinary humans look like children. Men who could grab a deer with their bare hands. Men who left footprints twice the size of normal feet. For 500 years, people have told this story. But is any of it true? The story begins in 1520. Ferdinand Magellan was leading an expedition. His ships sailed down the South American coast. They were searching for a passage to the Pacific Ocean. The journey was brutal. Storms battered the ships. Food ran low. Men grew sick. Therefore, Magellan ordered his crew to stop. They needed rest. They needed fresh water. They landed in a bay along the Patagonian coast. What happened next shocked everyone. According to the ship's chronicler, Antonio Pigafetta, they met someone. A man appeared on the beach, but he wasn't ordinary. He was enormous. Pigafetta wrote that the man was so tall that the Spanish sailors reached only to his waist. The crew stared in amazement. They had never seen anyone like this. Pigafetta described the encounter in detail. He said the giant wore animal skins. He danced and sang. He seemed friendly. The sailors tried to communicate with him. They offered him food and gifts. More giants appeared. The Spanish counted several of them. All were incredibly tall. All seemed peaceful. Therefore, Magellan's crew believed they had discovered a race of giants. But this wasn't the only report. Other explorers came to Patagonia. They wrote similar accounts. In 1578, Sir Francis Drake's crew reported seeing tall people. In 1741, George Anson's expedition mentioned giants. In 1766, Commodore Byron wrote about encountering people of gigantic stature. His crew measured one man at 7 feet tall, another at 8 feet. These weren't superstitious sailors. Many were educated men. They kept careful records. They drew maps. They recorded scientific observations. Therefore, their giant reports seemed credible. They all described the same thing: tall people in Patagonia, much taller than Europeans. The reports spread across Europe. Books were published. Maps showed Land of the Giants in Patagonia. Artists drew pictures of towering natives. The legend grew. Patagonia became famous for its giants. Therefore, more explorers went looking for the giants. They wanted to see these incredible people for themselves. But something strange happened. As more expeditions arrived, the giant sightings decreased. Later, explorers found tall people, yes, but not impossibly tall. Not twice the height of Europeans. The indigenous Tehuelche people were tall. Many stood over 6 feet. This was taller than average Europeans of that time, but they weren't giants. They were just tall humans. Therefore, historians began to doubt the earlier reports. Maybe Magellan's crew exaggerated. Maybe the measurements were wrong. Maybe the artists made the natives look bigger than they were. By the 1800s, most scholars dismissed the giant stories. They said the explorers had misunderstood. The Tehuelche were simply tall people. The giants were a myth. But the legend never died completely. Some people still believed. They pointed to the consistency of the reports. Different explorers, different time periods, different ships. Yet they all described unusually tall people. Could they all be wrong? Could they all be lying? Therefore, believers kept searching. They looked for evidence. They wanted proof that giants had existed. The debate continued for centuries. Scientists said, no, the giants were impossible. Human bones and muscles have limits. You can't be twice normal height and still function. Therefore, the reports must be false. But believers said yes. The reports were too consistent, too detailed, too specific. Therefore, something real must have inspired them. This is where our story really begins. Because in the frozen ground of Patagonia, people started finding bones. Unusual bones. Bones that made scientists uncomfortable. Bones that suggested maybe, just maybe, the old explorers had seen something real. Something that shouldn't exist, but somehow did. Tierra del Fuego means land of fire. It's an archipelago at the very tip of South America. The weather is harsh. The wind never stops. Snow falls even in summer. Few people dare to live here, but this frozen land holds secrets. Secrets buried in the ground for thousands of years. In the 1800s, explorers began finding bones. Large bones. Unusually large bones. These weren't animal bones. They were human. Or at least, they looked human, but their size was troubling. Femurs that suggested people over 7 feet tall, skulls larger than normal, jawbones thick and heavy. Therefore, questions arose. Who were these people? Why were they so big? One famous case involved a British naval surgeon. His name was Robert Fitzroy. In 1834, he was exploring Tierra del Fuego. His crew found a burial site. Inside were several skeletons. The bones were remarkably large. Fitzroy documented his findings. He sent some bones back to England. Museums received them. Scientists examined them. But then something strange happened. The bones disappeared from the records. No one knows where they went. This pattern repeated many times. Explorers found large bones. They documented them. They photographed them. They sent them to museums. But the bones vanished. Records were lost. Catalogues were incomplete. Therefore, skeptics asked, did these bones really exist? Or were they invented? Were the photographs fake? The evidence seemed to disappear whenever anyone looked closely, but not all evidence vanished. Some photographs survived. Early expedition photos show skeletons. Some look unusually large. One photo from 1898 shows a skeleton being excavated. The excavator stands next to it for scale. The skeleton appears much larger than normal. Another photo from 1915 shows a femur. It's held by a researcher. It looks enormous in his hands. Therefore, believers had proof, physical proof. These photographs existed. They were real, but skeptics remained unconvinced. They said the photos could be tricks, forced perspective, camera angles. Without the actual bones, photos proved nothing. Therefore, the debate continued. In the 1950s, Chilean archaeologists conducted surveys. They excavated several sites in Patagonia. They found human remains. Some were taller than average, but none were giants. Most fit within normal human variation. The tallest was about 6 feet 8 inches. Tall, yes, but not impossibly tall. Therefore, official archaeology concluded giants never existed. The people of Patagonia were simply tall humans, nothing more. But then came a discovery that changed everything. In 2003, a construction crew was working near Rio Grande. They were digging foundations for a building. Their machinery hit something hard. They stopped digging. They called archaeologists. When the researchers arrived, they found bones. Human bones. But these bones were different. They were larger than expected. Much larger. The excavation began carefully. The team worked slowly. They documented everything. They photographed each bone. They measured precisely. The skeleton was incomplete. Many bones were missing. But what remained was troubling. The femur suggested a person over 7 feet tall. The skull was unusually large. The jaw was thick and robust. Therefore, the team faced a dilemma. What should they report? They took samples for analysis. They wanted carbon dating. They wanted DNA testing. They wanted to understand what they had found. But they also knew the risks. If they claimed to find a giant, they would be ridiculed. Their careers could suffer. Their funding could stop. Therefore, they moved carefully. They published cautiously. They called the skeleton an unusually large individual. They avoided the word giant. but word leaked. Out. Local newspapers heard about the discovery. They wrote articles. The articles mentioned giants. The story spread on the internet. Suddenly, everyone was talking about it. The archaeologists faced pressure from both sides. Believers demanded more information. Skeptics demanded proof. Therefore, the team went silent. They stopped talking to the press. They focused on analysis. Years passed. The analysis continued, but no official report was published. No peer-reviewed paper appeared. The bones sat in a laboratory somewhere. Some people claimed they saw the bones. Others said they were hidden. Therefore, speculation grew. What did the tests reveal? Why the silence? What were the archaeologists hiding? This pattern, discoveries followed by silence, repeated across Patagonia. Bones appeared, then disappeared. Evidence surfaced, then vanished. Therefore, believers grew suspicious. Something was being covered up. Someone didn't want the truth known. But what was the truth, and why hide it? DNA testing can answer questions that bones alone cannot. It reveals ancestry. It shows relationships. It identifies species. Therefore, when unusual bones are found, DNA testing is crucial. It separates human from non-human. It distinguishes normal from abnormal. It provides scientific certainty, or so we thought. According to rumors, a small DNA sample was extracted from the Rio Grande skeleton. The sample was tiny, just a fragment, but it was enough for preliminary analysis. The lab that received it specialized in ancient DNA. They had experience with degraded samples. They knew how to handle difficult material. Therefore, they began their work. Ancient DNA is tricky. It degrades over time. It breaks into small pieces. It gets contaminated by bacteria and fungi. Modern DNA can mix with ancient DNA. Therefore, extracting clean results is difficult. Scientists must be careful. They must rule out contamination. They must verify their findings. This takes time. It takes multiple tests. It takes patience. The lab ran several tests. They looked at mitochondrial DNA first. This is DNA passed from mothers to children. It's easier to extract than nuclear DNA. It survives longer in old bones. Therefore, it's often the first thing scientists test. The results came back quickly, but they were strange, very strange. The mitochondrial markers didn't match known human populations. They were similar to human DNA, but not identical. Some sequences were different, some were unusual. Therefore, the researchers tested again. They wanted to confirm their results. They wanted to rule out contamination. They ran the tests multiple times. The results stayed consistent. Something was different about this DNA. But what did this mean? DNA can be different for many reasons. Contamination is one possibility. Modern bacteria contain DNA. This DNA can mix with ancient samples. Therefore, some unusual results are just bacterial contamination. Scientists must test carefully to separate human from non-human DNA. The lab did these tests. They found some contamination, but after removing it, the unusual markers remained. Another possibility is degradation. Old DNA breaks down, parts of it disappear. What remains can look unusual, like a book with missing pages. You can still read it, but it's incomplete. It might seem strange. Therefore, degraded DNA often shows weird results. This doesn't mean the person was weird, it just means the DNA is damaged. The lab considered this possibility. They looked for signs of degradation. They found some, but not enough to explain all the unusual markers. Some sequences were intact and complete, yet still different from normal human DNA. Therefore, the researchers faced a puzzle. What were they seeing? A third possibility is ancient human variation. Modern humans are remarkably similar genetically. We all share most of our DNA, but ancient humans were more diverse. Neanderthals had slightly different DNA. Denisovans had different DNA. Other extinct human groups existed. We're still discovering them. Therefore, unusual DNA might just mean an unknown ancient group. Not giants, not monsters, just humans we haven't identified yet. This explanation makes the most sense scientifically. Ancient humans varied more than modern humans. Some populations had unique genetic markers. These markers disappeared as populations mixed, but in isolated places like Patagonia, they might have survived longer. Therefore, Finding unusual DNA in Patagonia isn't shocking. It's actually expected. The region was isolated for thousands of years. Unique populations could have developed there, but the lab's preliminary report used different language. It said the DNA showed genetic anomalies inconsistent with any modern human lineage. This phrase is important. Inconsistent with modern human lineage doesn't mean non-human, it means different from living humans. Unusual, but unusual doesn't mean impossible. It doesn't mean alien, it just means we haven't seen it before. However, that phrase leaked. Someone at the lab talked to someone else. The information spread. Genetic anomalies became non-human DNA. Inconsistent with modern lineage became not human. The story grew. It changed. It became more sensational. Therefore, the legend exploded. People claimed scientists had proven giants existed. They claimed the DNA was unlike anything on Earth. The lab tried to clarify. They released a statement. They said their findings were preliminary. They said more testing was needed. They said the unusual markers could have many explanations. But the damage was done. The story was out. People believed what they wanted to believe. Therefore, the lab decided to stop. They refused to publish full results. They said the sample was too degraded. They said they couldn't reach conclusions. They went silent. This silence fueled more speculation. Why wouldn't they publish? What were they hiding? Some people said the DNA was too shocking, too controversial. The lab was being pressured to keep quiet. Others said the DNA was normal. The whole thing was a misunderstanding. The lab was embarrassed. Therefore, they buried the results. We may never know the truth. The DNA data hasn't been published. The bones are locked away. The scientists won't talk. Therefore, we're left with questions. Questions without answers. Mysteries without solutions. But one thing is certain. Something about those bones made scientists uncomfortable. Something unusual. Something that challenged expectations. The indigenous peoples of Patagonia have lived there for thousands of years, long before any European arrived, long before any ships crossed the ocean. They have stories passed down through generations, stories about the land, about the animals, about the past, and stories about beings who came before them. The Selknam people lived in Tierra del Fuego. They survived in one of Earth's harshest environments. They hunted, they gathered, they told stories around their fires. One story spoke of the elders. These were tall beings who lived long ago, before the Selknam arrived. The elders were strong, they were wise, but they were different. They weren't quite like the Selknam, they were something else. The Tehuelche people lived farther north, on the Patagonian plains. They also had stories. They spoke of the Tall Ones, beings who roamed the land in ancient times. Some stories said these beings were friendly. They taught the Tehuelche about hunting, about survival. Other stories said they were dangerous. They could be violent if provoked. Therefore, respect was important. The Mapuche people lived even farther north, in what is now Chile and Argentina. They too had legends. They spoke of giants who lived in the mountains. These giants were not gods. They were not monsters. They were just different people. People who existed before the Mapuche, people who eventually disappeared. No one knew where they went. What's remarkable is the consistency. These three groups lived far apart. They spoke different languages. They had different cultures. They rarely met each other. But they all told similar stories. Stories about tall beings from the past. Therefore, anthropologists faced a question. Why would separate groups tell the same story? What could explain this consistency? One answer is cultural diffusion. Maybe the story spread from group to group, through trade, through rare meetings, through occasional contact. Stories travel. They move between cultures. Therefore, one group's legend could become another group's legend. This happens all the time. It's a normal process. But another answer is more intriguing. Maybe the stories reflect real memory, cultural memory, memories of actual encounters. If tall people really lived in Patagonia, the indigenous peoples would remember them. They would incorporate them into their stories. They would pass these memories down. Therefore, the consistency might prove the legends are based on truth. Anthropologists study this question carefully. They know myths aren't simple lies. Myths often contain truth. Historical events become stories. Real people become legends. Details change over time, but a core of truth remains. Therefore, you can't dismiss indigenous stories. They might preserve actual history, history that happened before writing existed. For the indigenous peoples themselves, these stories aren't just entertainment, they're sacred knowledge. They're part of identity. They connect the present to the past. They explain the world. Therefore, when outsiders dismiss the stories as just myths, it's insulting. It suggests indigenous knowledge isn't valid. It suggests their ancestors were liars or fools. But treating the stories as simple history is also problematic. The stories contain symbolic elements. They have spiritual meanings. They teach moral lessons. Reducing them to giants existed or didn't exist misses the point. The stories mean more than that. They're about respect, about learning from the past, about understanding your place in the world. Therefore, we must be careful. We must honour these stories while still asking questions. Some elders today say the stories are about respect for ancestors. The tall ones represent earlier peoples, people who lived differently, who knew different things, who deserve to be remembered. The exact height doesn't matter. What matters is acknowledging those who came before, learning from them, honouring them. Therefore, the giant legends might be about cultural memory, about respecting history, not about literal giants. But other elders insist the stories are literal. They say their ancestors really encountered tall beings, not normal humans, something different. They say the old ones wouldn't lie. They wouldn't exaggerate. If they said the beings were twice normal height, they meant it. Therefore, the stories should be taken seriously, scientifically, seriously. We can't know which interpretation is correct. Maybe both contain truth. Maybe the stories preserve real memories of tall people, people within human variation, but who seemed giant-like to smaller populations. Maybe over time, the stories grew. The tall people became taller in the telling, but a seed of truth remained, a memory of real encounters with real people who were genuinely unusual. What we can say is this: the indigenous peoples of Patagonia have preserved stories for thousands of years. These stories matter to them. They should matter to us too. Whether they describe literal giants or symbolic ancestors, they're part of human history. They deserve respect. They deserve serious consideration. Science demands evidence, physical evidence, bones, DNA, photographs, measurements. Without evidence, claims are just stories. Therefore, when people claim to find giant bones, scientists ask, where are they? Show us the evidence. Let us examine it. Let us test it. Let us verify your claims. But here's the problem. The evidence keeps disappearing. Bones get lost. Samples vanish. Records become incomplete. Museums can't find specimens. Therefore, skeptics argue nothing unusual was ever found. If giants existed, we would have bones. We would have clear evidence. The fact that evidence is missing proves giants never existed. They were just myths, just exaggerations, nothing more. But believers see something sinister. They see a pattern. Too many bones have disappeared. Too many samples have gone missing. Too many records have vanished. Therefore, something suspicious is happening. Someone doesn't want the truth known. Someone is hiding evidence. Someone is protecting secrets. Let's look at specific cases. The bones Fitzroy sent to England in 1834. Gone. No record of them exists today. The British Museum has no record of receiving them. No catalogue entry. No storage location. The bones simply disappeared. Therefore, did they ever arrive? Were they lost in transit? Were they deliberately destroyed? We can't know. In 1896, a Swedish expedition found large bones in Patagonia. They documented them carefully. They took measurements. They made sketches. They shipped several specimens to Stockholm. The Natural History Museum there received them. But when researchers tried to locate these specimens in the 1950s, they couldn't find them. The museum had no record. The bones had vanished. Therefore, what happened to them? In 1928, an Argentine archaeologist found unusual bones near San Julian. He published a paper. He described the bones in detail. He compared them to normal human bones. He concluded they were anomalous. He said they deserved further study, but but the bones themselves were never seen again. His museum claimed they were lost during a reorganization. Therefore, we can't verify his findings. We must trust his word, or not. This pattern continues into modern times. The 2003 Rio Grande discovery, bones found, tests started, then silence. Where are those bones now? The excavating team won't say. They claim privacy concerns. They say they need more time. But years have passed, decades in some cases, yet no full report appears. Therefore, people wonder, what are they hiding? Scientists have explanations. Museums lose things. It happens. Collections are vast. Records are incomplete. Wars destroy archives. Fires damage storage. Floods ruin specimens. Natural disasters happen. Therefore, missing bones don't prove conspiracy. They prove museums aren't perfect. They prove record keeping has always been flawed. Also, controversial findings face special scrutiny. Scientists are careful. They don't want to be wrong. They don't want to be embarrassed. If you claim something extraordinary, you need extraordinary evidence. Therefore, researchers with unusual finds move slowly. They test repeatedly. They verify carefully. This takes time. It looks like silence, but it's just careful science. But here's the thing. We've found other unusual human remains. Neanderthal bones, Denisovan bones, Homo floresiensis bones. These discoveries were controversial too. Scientists were skeptical, but the evidence was preserved, it was studied, it was published. Museums kept the bones. Researchers could examine them. The scientific process worked. Therefore, why doesn't it work for the giant bones? Why do these specific specimens disappear? Denisovans were discovered from tiny fragments. A single pinky bone, a few teeth, that's all. But these fragments were enough. Scientists kept them. They tested them. They published results. The evidence remained available. Therefore, we know Denisovans existed. We can verify the findings. But giant bones, they vanish before verification happens. Wait, some scientists admit the problem. They say controversial findings face institutional bias. Museums don't want to store weird specimens. Universities don't want to fund controversial research. Journals don't want to publish fringe findings. Therefore, evidence of unusual humans gets suppressed, not through conspiracy, but through systematic discouragement, through scientific conservatism, through institutional inertia. This creates a catch-22. To prove giants existed, we need evidence. But evidence gets lost or ignored. Therefore, we can't prove giants existed. Therefore, scientists say giants never existed. Therefore, new evidence gets ignored. The cycle continues. Nothing changes. The mystery remains unsolved. What would it take to break this cycle? Clear, undeniable evidence. Multiple specimens. Multiple labs testing them. Published results. Open access. Complete transparency. Until that happens, the debate continues. Believers claim cover-up. Skeptics claim no evidence exists. Both sides talk past each other. Neither convinces the other. Therefore, the truth stays hidden. In missing bones, in vanished samples, in scientific silence. Let's step back. Let's think clearly. What if unusual bones really were found? What could they mean? We need to consider possibilities. Not jump to conclusions, not assume giants, but not dismiss everything either. Let's think like scientists. What could explain unusually large human remains? First possibility, normal human variation. Humans come in different sizes. Most people are average height, but some people are very tall. This is normal. It's called variation. Genes cause it. Some families are tall, some populations are tall. The Dinka people of South Sudan average over 6 feet. The Tutsi people of East Africa are often very tall. Therefore, finding tall skeletons in Patagonia might just mean tall people lived there. Not giants, just tall humans. But how tall can humans get? The tallest recorded person was Robert Wadlow. He reached 8 feet 11 inches, but he had a growth disorder. His size caused health problems. He died young. Most extremely tall people face similar issues. Joint pain, heart problems, mobility difficulties. Therefore, a whole population of 8-foot tall people seems unlikely. Their bodies couldn't handle it. But a few unusually tall individuals? That's possible. That's actually normal. Second possibility, an unknown ancient population. Human history is more complex than we thought. We keep discovering new groups. Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo floresiensis. These were different types of humans. They looked different, they had different DNA, but they were still human, just different branches of the human family tree. Therefore, maybe Patagonia had its own unique population. People who were taller on average, who had distinctive features, who left unusual bones. This makes scientific sense. Patagonia was isolated, mountains and oceans surrounded it. Populations there evolved separately. They adapted to local conditions. They developed unique traits. Some might have been taller, some might have had robust bones. Therefore, finding unusual skeletons doesn't mean non-human. It means an isolated human population we haven't fully studied yet. Third possibility, megafauna confusion. Patagonia had giant animals, giant ground sloths. They stood 10 feet tall, giant armadillos, giant birds. These creatures went extinct thousands of years ago, but their bones remain. Early explorers found these bones. Sometimes human bones and megafauna bones got mixed together. Therefore, some giant human reports might actually be misidentified as animal bones. Honest mistakes, not lies, just confusion. Fourth possibility, mythologized memory. Real events become legends. Details change. Stories grow. Maybe the Tehuelche really were unusually tall, 6.5 feet on average. Europeans in the 1500s averaged 5.5 feet. Therefore, the Tehuelche seemed very tall. Explorers were impressed. They exaggerated. Stories spread. The tall people became giants in the telling. Therefore, there's truth in the legend, but not literal giants, just tall people remembered as giants. Fifth possibility, a hybrid explanation, maybe several factors combined. There were tall people in Patagonia, real tall people, within normal human variation, but unusually tall for their time. Their bones got mixed with megafauna bones. Explorers confused them. Stories spread. Over time, the legend grew. Real tall people became mythical giants. Therefore, you can't say the legend is entirely true, but you can't say it's entirely false either. It's complicated. It's a mix of truth and exaggeration. What about the non-human lineage phrase? This phrase is powerful. It suggests something alien, something wrong, something that shouldn't exist. But scientifically, it might just mean not matching modern human populations. Ancient humans had different DNA. Isolated populations developed unique markers. Non-human lineage might just mean an ancient human group we haven't identified yet. Not aliens, not monsters, just ancient humans who were slightly different. We must be responsible. We must not fuel pseudoscience. Claims about giants often lead to wild sides. Theories, ancient aliens, lost civilizations, supernatural beings. These theories aren't supported by evidence. They're entertaining, but they're not science. Therefore, we must be careful. We must stick to plausible explanations. We must consider evidence. We must think critically. At the same time, we must stay open. Science advances by questioning, by investigating, by being curious. If we dismiss every unusual finding, we might miss real discoveries. Denisovans were dismissed at first, but they were real. Homo floresiensis seemed impossible, but they existed. Therefore, unusual bones deserve serious study, not instant dismissal, not blind belief, but genuine scientific investigation. So what's the verdict? We don't know. We honestly don't know. The evidence is incomplete. The bones are missing. The DNA results are unpublished. The truth is uncertain. Maybe giants existed. Maybe they didn't. Maybe the truth is somewhere in between. A real population of tall people, remembered and exaggerated over centuries, turned into legends, turned into myths, but based on something real. What we need is evidence, real evidence, properly studied, properly published, properly preserved. Until then, we have questions, we have mysteries, we have stories, but we don't have answers. Not yet. Maybe someday, maybe never. The giants of Patagonia remain a mystery. Let's imagine for a moment. Let's set aside our skepticism. Let's consider a possibility. What if the explorers were telling the truth? What if they really saw what they described? What if giants really walked the frozen shores of Patagonia 500 years ago? Magellan's crew described people twice their height. Pigafetta wrote detailed accounts. He described their clothing, their behavior, their size. He measured them against the Spanish sailors. He said they towered over them. What if he wasn't exaggerating? What if he was just reporting what he saw? What would that mean? It would mean human diversity is greater than we think. It would mean isolated populations can develop extreme traits. It would mean we still have much to learn about ancient peoples. It would mean the textbooks need rewriting. Our understanding of human evolution would change. We would need to reconsider what's possible. Therefore, the implications are enormous. But it would also raise questions. Where did these people go? Why don't we have clear evidence? How could an entire population disappear? These questions need answers. Maybe they died from disease. European contact brought smallpox, measles, influenza. These diseases killed native populations. Maybe the giants died too. Maybe they left no survivors. Therefore, only bones remain, only stories remain, only memories remain. Or maybe they weren't that unusual. Maybe twice the height was an exaggeration, not a lie, just an impression. When you're 5.5 feet tall and you meet someone 7 feet tall, they seem enormous. They seem twice your size, even if they're not. Therefore, the explorers might have been truthful, but their measurements were impressions, not precise data. They saw very tall people. Their minds exaggerated slightly. The legends grew from there. Or maybe we're looking in the wrong places. Patagonia is vast. Much of it is unexplored. Glaciers cover ancient sites. Ocean waters rose since ancient times. Old settlements might be underwater. Dunes might be frozen in ice. We've barely scratched the surface. Therefore, the evidence might still be waiting, in some remote valley, under some glacier, in some unmapped cave, waiting for the right explorer to find it. Modern science gives us new tools: ground-penetrating radar, DNA sequencing, isotope analysis, dating techniques. We can learn more from bones than ever before. We can extract DNA from tiny fragments. We can determine diet from teeth. We can trace ancestry from isotopes. Therefore, if we found giant bones today, we could study them properly. We could answer the questions. We could solve the mystery. But here's what's interesting. Even without giants, the story teaches us something. It teaches us about human nature. We want mysteries. We want wonders. We want the world to be bigger than we think. Therefore, we create legends. We tell stories. We preserve mysteries. Not because we're foolish, but because mysteries give life meaning. They remind us we don't know everything. They keep us curious. They keep us exploring. The indigenous peoples understood this. Their stories weren't just about tall beings. They were about respect, about honoring the past, about remembering those who came before. Whether those beings were 10 feet tall or 6 feet tall didn't matter. What mattered was the remembering, the honoring, the learning. Therefore, the stories served a purpose. They kept knowledge alive. They preserved cultural memory. They connected generations. What about modern people? What do we gain from this legend? We gain wonder. We gain curiosity. We gain humility. We're reminded that the world is still mysterious, that history still has secrets, that science doesn't have all answers yet. Therefore, the giant legend serves us too. It keeps us questioning. It keeps us learning. It keeps us exploring. Maybe the truth about Patagonian giants will never be known. Maybe the bones are gone forever. Maybe the evidence was lost. Maybe it never existed. But the legend survives. It survived 500 years. It survived skepticism. It survived science. It survived modernity. Why? Because humans need mysteries. We need wonders. We need stories that challenge us, that make us think, that make us question. So did giants walk the frozen shores of Patagonia? We don't know. We may never know, but the question itself is valuable. It makes us think about human diversity, about ancient populations, about what's possible, about what we don't know. Therefore, the mystery serves a purpose. Even without an answer, the giants might have been real, or they might have been tall people turned into legends, or they might have been myths from the start. But they're part of human history now, part of our collective imagination, part of our ongoing conversation with the past. And that makes them real in a way that bones alone could never be. What do you believe?